Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Monique Jackson, and I'm an Associate Vice President in the Metropolitan Housing and Communities Policy Center here at the Urban Institute. I'm also the moderator for today's event focused on fair housing and land use, which is the first event in the Advancing Racial Equity in Our Communities event series. I want to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon. Before we start, some quick housekeeping. The event is being recorded and the recording will be posted online afterward. Speaker bios are available online at urban.org and a link to the bios will be posted in the chat. All participants are muted, but you can send questions or comments in the Q&A box at any time. And we do hope to have enough time for audience Q&A at the end. Please take 1 or 2 minutes to complete the survey at the end of the event. And finally, if you tweet about the event today, please tweet using the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. Welcome again. Urban researchers have long demonstrated that Black, Indigenous, and other people of color face systematically inequitable access to safe, quality, affordable housing. And a core part of our work is studying inequities caused by systemically racist policies that have long affected communities and on finding solutions that advance racial equity, build resilience, and bring community members into the process of economic development in meaningful ways. This event was born out of that work and that commitment to advancing evidence-based solutions to really address these inequities. In today's events, we'll explore how local land use policies, particularly in the form of exclusionary zoning, inhibit millions of Black and Brown Americans' abilities to secure stable, affordable housing and leverage housing mobility options. Our panel will discuss solutions to address the barriers to largely Black and Brown communities thriving economically and sustainably in the context of decentralized governance, NIMBYism, racism, displacement, and inadequate public resources. Urban is committed to bringing research and tools to help shape and inform those solutions. And one of our core efforts that my urban colleagues will discuss in more detail is the recently launched Land Use Lab at Urban, or LULU, as we call it. LULU's work fills several key gaps. Researchers, advocates, and policymakers do not yet have adequate access to basic comparable data on local land use regulations to help them understand how such regulations affect housing development in communities. And though some local governments are experimenting with innovative reforms, we know little about how effective they are over the short and long term, how specific elements of the reforms affect communities, particularly communities of color, or how they may interact with other policies and programs. Moreover, real or perceived conflicts between public policy goals can impede adoption of smart and effective reforms. LULU researchers will provide better land use data, new analysis on regulatory impacts, and insights into best practices to adopt reforms. And we look forward to sharing what we learn and what we find with change makers across the nation to inform a more equitable approach to fair housing and land use. Our panelists this afternoon will provide a contextualized understanding of the challenges of local land use policies, the impacts on predominantly Black and Brown communities, and the needs and opportunities for driving change. So I'm honored to be joined today by Yona Freemark. Yona is a Senior Research Associate in the Metropolitan Housing and Communities Policy Center, or METRO for short, and the Research Director of LULU. Our next panelist is Eleanor Noble. Eleanor is a research analyst in METRO, also here at Urban. We're also joined by Terry Taplin. Terry is a council member from the city of Berkeley, California, as well as a poet and a mobility and environmental justice activist. And our last panelist, though certainly not least, is Emily Liu, who has served as director of the Louisville Metropolitan Planning and Design Services since 2013. Please join me in virtually welcoming our panelists. Welcome, guys. So Yona and Eleanor, let's start with you. Let's begin by talking about the role that land use regulations, and racial equity. You were part of the team at Urban that recently launched a feature called Unlocking the Zoning Code, which details some of the relationships between zoning and racial equity. Can you give us a brief overview of what you found when doing that research? And Yona, feel free to start.
Absolutely. So thank you so much for hosting this, Monique, and it's exciting to be part of this wonderful panel today. So, I think there's been a lot of discussion out there about the role of zoning maps in enforcing racist, that the way that zoning districts are drawn across our communities was based on racist motivations and is encouraging additional racist outcomes today. You'll often see that when folks compare redlining maps that were drawn in the 1930s with zoning maps today, showing that the historically whitest, wealthiest communities throughout the country are often those that have the fewest provisions to allow for affordable housing because they ban everything but single-family homes, for example. But when we went into this project, which again is called Unlocking the Zoning Code, we had sort of a broader perspective. We can't just think about zoning as a map that developers and landowners use to make choices about how to change land. We think that this is a really important insight from the perspective of encouraging land use regulations reform to encourage more racial equity. And we need local, state, and federal governments to be thinking of the nationwide implications of moving beyond the zoning map and understanding how to improve zoning. So rather than just map the map and the districts themselves, that's the as of right zoning that we refer to as base zoning, we show that there are other really important elements of local zoning that must be understood and addressed when thinking about how to reform zoning for racial equity. So number one, we need to be thinking about flexibility measures, the rules that can allow developers to get around those baseline regulations. These are things like conditional uses, variances, and zoning changes. And these can often be applied inequitably, depending on the circumstances. Second, we need to be thinking about requirements, exactions, and incentives. These are rules like parking requirements or costs like impact fees that can make financing projects like affordable housing really difficult. Third, we need to be thinking about administration. So who are the people who are actually making choices about zoning in our communities? Who's on the planning board? And are they representative of the community at large? And finally, we need to be thinking about procedures. So what are the review and approval systems that local governments use to make projects happen? These processes have the tendency to make it quite difficult to build multifamily housing in many cases. So our perspective is that effectively rethinking the zoning code to promote racial equity means thinking about all these issues together in parallel and finding ways that they result in inequitable outcomes on top of changes in the baseline zoning map. What do you think, Eleanor?
Yeah, and I will just also add that one of the things we found when we were laying out those key elements that Yona just went over was that administration and governance in particular plays a really huge role in the creation and implementation of equitable zoning codes. So researchers like Einstein, Glick, and Palmer have showed that public engagement in the land use and zoning process are generally dominated by white, male, affluent homeowners, but we actually don't know how diverse these administrative bodies and governing bodies that make a lot of these decisions actually are. So I'm really excited to say that at Lulu, we recently launched a survey to planning departments across the country to help us better understand the racial and gender diversity of these decision-making bodies. So we hope that this data can give us more insight into what feeds into creating equitable zoning decisions and housing outcomes.
Thank you, Yona. Thank you, Eleanor. I want to shift to Emily and Terry. Can you talk a little bit and tell us about how you got interested in the subject of exclusionary zoning, and how does this issue impact your work in Louisville and in Berkeley, particularly relating to racial equity? Terry, can we start with you?
Sure. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Hello, Monique. So I became interested through my own experience of displacement. I grew up here in Berkeley, third generation Black Berkeleyan. And, when my husband and I were finishing undergrad, we found ourselves in a situation that is unfortunately pretty common out here in Berkeley. We were living in an unpermitted sublease in a tiny rent control apartment that was rotting from the inside. and we had to vacate. We had to leave, and we were talking to all of our friends, trying to figure out how we could stay in Berkeley. And one of our older, wealthier, whiter friends, who spends half the year on a horse ranch in Germany and the other half in a condo in Richmond, was like, "Oh, I don't see why you can't just find another apartment," And we tried, and we ended up across the bay in South San Francisco, living with our friend and her mom. And for me, that was really, honestly kind of terrifying, because like growing up, the kids who I grew up with, we have this saying that once someone leaves Berkeley, they never come back. Um, and I did come back. I'm living with my mom now. We're both here with my mom. But it just really, like, it just struck me. It's like, how can a college town that is leading the world on all these justice issues, this beacon of inclusion and progress, why would it be so impossible for two young people to find an apartment? And it's because most of the city is zoned for single family homes, and that was deliberate. And so on council, I represent District 2, which is Southwest Berkeley. It's a historically Black and brown working class community, historically disinvested. We were downzoned, and we, in recent decades, have rapidly gentrified. And these are not mutually exclusive. These are continuous. These two things. And so a big part of what we do in my office is land use reform, particularly trying to redress our legacy of exclusion and segregation in Berkeley.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Emily Liu with Liu Metro Planning and Design Services. First of all, as a planner, I must acknowledge that planning agencies and planning professionals in the United States have contributed either directly or indirectly to racial inequity throughout, policies, practices, regulations, such as exclusionary zoning. My experience has been, I think there are three distinct phases of these exclusionary zoning. First of all, when zoning became legal at the time in the 1930s and 20s, it was meant to separate incompatible uses, such as heavy industry and residential. But eventually, it became more and more of a tool to separate people. And we can see in the 50s and 60s in Louisville and other cities, the residential zoning has been divided up into many different categories: very low residential, medium residential, high residential, and then the lowest residential has to be protected from everybody else. Basically, why? It's all just people, right? So I think the early years planners not only helped create single family zoning, but also defended it. And then in many times defended. I'm the first one to acknowledge that as a professional planner. And then during a certain stage, I think we just do nothing. And there's nothing, just this has been done for all decades and decades. Nothing has been done. No, but I think for me, personally, what make a change is that when I learned the history of the exclusion zoning, why it exists today, how it came about, why our city in Louisville, for example, still segregated, still have a big wealth gap between white and Black, still have a big difference in terms of health outcome. If you look at all the root causes, it pointed out to all these policies. And that's where they make me and my colleagues in planning design really want to do something about it. And that is really driving us to do this zoning reform, which I'm going to talk a little bit later. But the history, learning the history ourselves, a lot of planners probably do not know this. If you talk to people of color who live here, and I talked to some African-American in Louisville, and they said, we know this all along. we lived through this, but a lot of planners, a lot of other people may not know this history. So I think learning history is make a big difference in me personally, and also in terms of our planning design agency, all the plan, we study this together, we research it together, we learn it together. That's a big difference. But that's only, I would say, the last 7, 8 years, not all throughout the history of planning and zoning.
Thank you, Emily. Terry, I want to go back to you. You've been fighting to legalize fourplexes in Berkeley. And I know the city council voted last year to try to end single-family zoning in the city by the end of 2022. How will this policy change, or sort of, how will this policy change really encourage better access to housing for all and affordable housing for all?
Mhm. We have a lot of families in Berkeley that live intergenerationally. We have folks who are aging in place, whose children or grandchildren have moved away, and we also have grandchildren and children who, or rather, we have children and grandchildren who want to come back to Berkeley. And so if we have like a senior who lives in a large single family home, if they were able to subdivide, they would be able to, provide housing for their relatives or for students to supplement their income or whomever. And that's one way that re-legalizing fourplexes would allow us to make more housing available. When you can tour several parts of the city, like my neighborhood has a mix of fourplexes, apartments, and single family homes. Now, most of those are now illegal in my neighborhood. And then across town, you see these large, beautiful 10plexes as well. And if we can, bring that housing back, we would not only be able to allow more people to live with their relatives or whomever, but also get more lower income, more moderate income folks into these, exclusive neighborhoods across town, where plexes used to be legal. In Berkeley, we have, we have such a huge income disparity. If you're fortunate to be able to, throw down $5 million in cash for a house in the hills, great. If you're one of the few folks who are able to make it through that 10-year affordable housing wait list into a subsidized unit, that's also great. But we have a lot of folks, teachers, firefighters, nurses, for whom there really isn't housing available in Berkeley. So fourplexes, as missing middle housing for moderate income households, would allow us to, make sure that our district isn't losing teachers, and that we have folks who are able to remain in our fire department because they're not having to drive several hours a day each way. And so fourplexes are just one piece of a comprehensive overhaul of our exclusionary policies that we're trying to push forward. It's great that we passed a resolution last year, but now we sort of have to survive each and every skirmish that some of our colleagues and our wonderful community members are trying to. So the fight will continue, but that's it's something I'm very much committed to.
Thank you, Terry. Emily, first off, I really appreciate your comments and sort of the acknowledgement and understanding of the role planning played to get us here, but also thinking about the role planning can play to undo harms, right, and move forward in a different way. You've been leading an effort in Louisville to conduct an equity review of your community zoning code. Can you explain sort of what that means and what the lessons that you're learning are about what really has worked?
Yes. So I briefly talk about, learning the history, and that's very important. So when we're going through the history of planning zoning in Louisville, I believe somebody going to drop it in the chat. We do have a story map called Confronting Racism in City Planning and Zoning, specifically to Louisville, but other cities have very similar experience for the last 100 years. So when we're doing that, we know during the last 100 years, those policies, regulations, and practice, a lot of them are intentional, creating these where we are today, still have a big impact today. Like in Louisville, back in 1914, we have housing segregation ordinance. Very few cities have done that. So that's kind of unique for Louisville. And then everybody experienced the redlining, the urban renewal disrupt a lot of the vibrant African-American community in Louisville and elsewhere. And also deed restrictions, private deed restriction, unfortunately, is very effective, in keeping people out, undesirable people out. First of all, it just blatantly saying, people of color cannot live in this community, and later evolve in something else like minimum lot size, minimum size of the homes, exclusion of accessory dwelling unit. I can talk about that a little bit more. And then in the 50s, 60s, zoning started to become a tool as an exclusionary tool. As I mentioned earlier, very low density. They want to keep out other medium density residential and single family, excluding a multifamily, duplex, triplex, fourplex. So when we learn the history, we know it was intentional. So we feel that in correcting those history, we also need to be intentional and focus on equity in order to provide an equitable and inclusionary city for all residents. So that's why we started this. And we work closely with our Metro Council. So this started during the peak of the social justice movement, the summer of 2020. I think that really gave us a lot of momentum. So we work with Metro Council, we worked with the Planning Commission, and they adopted a formal resolution, acknowledge the history, and therefore call for reform of our zoning. And so that's very powerful. We started there, and also the mayor's office also issued a press release, support the effort we're doing. So we started in the summer of 2020. We all know what happened there in addition to social justice movement. We are in the middle of a pandemic. So public engagement is a little challenge. At the time, we don't have any full-time staff, we don't have any budget, but actually to our advantage, all of that, we don't have full-time staff. And then we just call for volunteers in our planning department. We ended up with more than 20 people volunteer for this project. These are all passionate planners in our department. They have a daily job that's above and beyond what they're doing, but they want to make a difference. They want to make our city more equitable, inclusive, so they all volunteer. And the thing about that is, I didn't know we have such a creative mind, our young planners especially, and they may just started out their profession here in the office. They have such a creative idea. Like during the pandemic, we know we cannot do in-person public engagement, but then we did like a hotline. We also talk to radio shows. We meet in the park, just very creative way to engage the public. And also we don't have a budget, also came to our advantage because we don't have to go through a lengthy 6 months sometime process to select council. We can get it going right away. So the project got started very quickly, summer of 2020, with extensive public engagement best we can. Sometimes we engage certain community, like immigrant community, they don't even have email. We do have to go and meet with them somewhere, one-on-one sometime, and meet with the leaders, as much as we can. So with all the public engagement and also the research that I mentioned, we did extensive research, not just about history, but also best practice. So that's very important. We also have advisors that are helping us. Urban Institute help us a lot as advisor throughout the reform process from the very beginning, providing needed research and facts to support a lot of our recommendations. We have people from outside our advocacy group, Housing Coalition, Affordable Housing Trust Fund, AARP become one of our best partners in this, and then Metropolitan Housing Coalition and other advisors like Gina Dunlap is a local leader, and they all, we will work together. The good thing is about our reform that we can undertake this quickly and have some result is that we have Metro Council on board at the very beginning, as I mentioned. So after all the research engagement, we have some recommendation. We don't want just do the talk, just the talk. We want to take some action, even though it's a small action, low-hanging fruit. We want to make sure the community sees some tangible results. Because for so long, a lot of people talk, but never have any action. So it's only from, it's a big project. It's a multiple years, still ongoing. We want to make sure we have some results. We break it down into different phases. So the first phase is 6 recommendations. All of that has been adopted. It was last year, but last summer. And one of them is for 70 years, we were trying to do that, but finally we got it done. As Una said, some of these, the process is very important. By right versus you have to go through a discretionary review. So accessory dwelling unit, a lot of people call it granny flat, carriage house. So we got that adopted last summer by Metro Council. So now it's by right. It's not a discretionary review. It makes a big difference. I know there's another chat probably going to be having a link to some of the things we've been doing with ADU. So accessory dwelling unit, just give you some number. The last 8 months, we've been receiving applications. So the number of applications we received for the last 8 months is equivalent to the conditional use permit that we had for the last 10 years. So it increased more than 10-fold just because the process, as Una mentioned, make it by right, make it so easy, make a big difference. So that's one of the things we did in terms of housing. So Louisville, at 75% of land is zoning single family. And before this ADU was adopted, it is single family only. You can't even put that ADU. Now, the 75%, legally, they can do ADU. Now, they're still subject to deed restriction, which we hope in the future will be eliminated, but they open up to ADUs. The other thing we did is that allowing duplex in multifamily zoning. You were wondering why multifamily does not allow duplex, because the lot is not big enough. So there's a density requirement. For in Louisville, most of the multifamily is on like R6, require minimum 5,000 square feet to have 2 units. So any multifamily zoned property under 5,000 square feet, you cannot even have a duplex. And that's really a low hanging fruit. When we go through the public engagement, nobody opposed to that because of that regulation density really prohibit that duplex in multifamily zoning. As a result of that change, that was approved by Metro Council unanimously. We opened up 10,000 property, 10,000 parcels in Louisville, and now you can either build a duplex or convert a single family to a duplex. Even if you think about even 5% of that eventually got built, you are offering 500 more housing units. So little things like this, I think it's just very easy, no opposition. So we got that. There are 4 other changes that we made last summer. I'm not going to elaborate on that, but you can really check on that online, what we have adopted, and I'll be happy to talk to anyone who are interested in learning a little bit more.
Thank you so much, Emily. Those don't feel like little changes. Those feel like they've had some really big impact. So I want to pose this question to the whole panel. So anyone feel free to answer. We have heard a lot about single family zoning and its racist origins. We've also heard about the need to eliminate it to provide more housing options for more people. But I'm wondering how about communities where residents of single family homes are largely Black and brown and or lower income? How do we ensure stability for those communities while also ensuring that they benefit from these type of changes? So again, anyone on the panel, but I'm curious, how do we make sure that we're protecting those communities as well and creating opportunities for benefit? Maybe Yona, do you want to jump in?
Well, I actually want to give a chance to Eleanor to start this off, if possible.
Awesome.
Yeah, Yona, you can follow up, but this is relevant, very relevant to both of us. And I think this also touches on some questions we've seen in the chat so far. So thank you for asking this. It's a really great question. And Yona and I recently worked on this study of single-family rental property ownership in the Twin Cities, which I think is a really good case study for this. Again, I'm biased. I'm from Minneapolis, so if I'm ever hypercritical, that's why. But Minneapolis has one of the largest Black and white homeownership gaps in the country, and it's also, of course, known for its elimination of single-family zoning in 2018. So in our research, we found that in neighborhoods with large shares of low-income residents and residents of color, these are the neighborhoods where racist lending practices led to disproportionate foreclosures for Black and brown homeowners and low-income and first-time homeowners. And in these neighborhoods, after the Great Recession, we found a subsequent rise of investor-owned single-family rentals. So we also know that there are still currently low-income single-family homeowners, of course, and homeowners of color in the Twin Cities who are facing housing cost burdens. And throughout our conversations and our research, we've heard fears, like a lot of fears about how the elimination of single-family zoning and that coupled with the housing market, just the bonkers housing market during COVID, could really exacerbate this pre-existing racialized displacement of these low-income single-family homeowners and homeowners of color. But also, supposedly in response to that, some planners and politicians have actually proposed to ban rental property conversions or create caps to the number of rental properties in certain neighborhoods. And I just want to emphasize that in terms of a policy solution, this doesn't really solve two of the underlying issues that are creating some of these problems, which we need to increase the housing stability for these low-income residents, homeowners and renters, and residents of color. And we also need to address, of course, the very real housing shortage that the Twin Cities is facing. So ideally, there wouldn't be this hierarchy between homeowners and renters, and all residents, renters included, especially, would be able to have a financially stable, happy, and healthy life without just relying on wealth accumulation through property ownership. But I think there are a number of other ways to address this very real concern of displacement for precarious homeowners in rapidly gentrifying cities. So this can include things like enhanced financial assistance and foreclosure prevention for homeowners and potential home buyers, down payment assistance, targeted transaction fees for those out-of-region institutional investors in single-family homes, and of course, citywide housing reparation funds like those that we've seen in Evanston, Illinois. The reality in the Twin Cities is that this single-family zoning elimination actually hasn't really been the driving force behind the increase in housing production. So less than 100 units of the 9,000 units that were produced between 2020 and 2022 were actually those conversions from single-family plots to duplexes or triplexes. So a lot of researchers really think that the elimination of parking minimums, which we mentioned before, was a much stronger facilitator of building new apartment buildings and really driving that production increase. So of course, there are very real challenges to actually making single-family zoning elimination not only produce more housing and work how it's supposed to work, but we can do that through things like financing, looking at restrictive lot sizes or building codes, but we also need to ensure, and I think this is really important, especially in places that are looking at single-family zoning elimination, but ensuring that the new units are also largely being produced in affluent, single-family and historically exclusionary neighborhoods that have really been hoarding resources and city amenities for decades, and renters deserve access to those amenities. So we need to do that and ensure that existing tenants and homeowners of color are also stably housed.
Yeah, and just to follow up
Thank
on
you.
that.
I just wanted to say really quickly, thank you, Eleanor. That was really interesting. And I didn't understand how that actually ended up working. So thank you for that. I'm sorry, go ahead, Yona.
No. I mean, I think Eleanor pointed to some of the major issues. We have a number of different policy avenues to try to increase housing availability, to prevent displacement, and to encourage more wealth building among people who are of color and people who are lower incomes. I think one of the biggest problems we have in the US is that because the conversation about housing affordability has become so prominent, I think that we've sometimes lost the very real housing equity and commitment to homeownership that exists among a huge share of people of color in this country. Lots of people who are Black and brown own single family homes, want to remain in them and want stability in them. And we shouldn't dismiss that as a minor issue in this conversation. It is key to this conversation because those people deserve the right to housing just as much as anybody else and shouldn't be ignored in the process of zoning reforms. So I think that when we're talking about things like upzoning and changing our zoning policies, yes, we need to be talking about finding ways to build new apartment buildings, finding ways to ensure that there's new affordable housing that's being constructed. But at the same time, if we're not making sure that people who currently live in communities can stay in those communities and that are able to, especially people of color who own their homes today, are able to maintain their ownership of those homes, then we've committed a major mistake in our policies. So I think we need to connect our zoning reform conversation with a lot of the things that Eleanor brought up. Assistance to prevent people from going through foreclosures, assistance with giving people who are lower incomes down payment money. Without those kind of important policies in place, you could end up with a situation where, unfortunately, the changes in zoning policy actually end up increasing displacement.
I want to stay on this point about gentrification and displacement and sort of the role of land use policy in preventing it. Maybe I'll shift now to Emily and to Terry. Is there a role for land use policy in preventing gentrification and displacement? And what does that look like? Maybe Terry, let's start with you.
Sure, I would like to sort of respond to the other question. I think, it's critical that we keep all of our folks in their homes. I think habitability is a big part of that. We see a lot of low-income homeowners struggling to maintain their properties. I think the city and the government should provide assistance. I think also when we're adding new housing, it's important that there be homeownership opportunities in the new housing for folks as well. But also the other part, also a big part of, or not a big part, but one factor of, why people end up leaving their neighborhoods is how much the city invests in services and infrastructure in that area. If I'm an aging Black homeowner and I'm, paying all these taxes and my street looks like, a crumbled Oreo, what am I doing? I'm probably gonna start thinking about leaving. So for neighborhoods that are historically disinvested, it's really important that the city, I'm thinking of Berkeley, but all cities really invest resources in those areas so that people who live there feel like they're valued and that their concerns are being taken seriously. As far as land use and preventing displacement and gentrification, another part of it is jobs. If there's nowhere to work or live in the city, of course there's going to be displacement and gentrification. So where I am, I have half of the city's manufacturing zones and some of the most complicated land use in the whole city because we have neighborhoods up against, labs and factories and warehouses. And in our industrial land use, there's been such an effort to restrict, startups and tech and software, which for this region makes zero sense because people are just going to go right next door anyway. And not only are we, bleeding talent to our neighboring cities, we're also, all the young people who grew up here are leaving Berkeley for Boston and Chicago, et cetera. So I think it's really important to make sure that the kids who grew up here, who come up through Berkeley schools, are able to stay in their neighborhoods and work in Berkeley. Because otherwise, of course, we're going to see demographic turnover because it will become a bedroom community for San Francisco otherwise.
Emily?
Yes, I have 2 points to make, and I kind of follow up on the previous question, which is about Black neighborhood. And again, from the history perspective, 100 years, our Black residents in Louisville are not allowed to live everywhere. So the Black neighborhood, there's one historic Black neighborhood or a lot of historic Black neighborhood where they're allowed to live in the, early part of the last century. They are usually very constrained in terms of environmental restriction. They are usually in the lowland, prone to flooding. So even today still have an impact on that. And they would like to maintain that single family. And that makes sense because there's an environmental constraint. The other Black neighborhood that we have in Louisville, they live actually, even though they're single family, they're mostly zoned multifamily. So they live mostly in a multifamily zoning already. So if you promote additional multifamily in the neighborhood, they're saying people are saying we don't want it either. What they really mean is that we had enough of our fair share. Entire block is boarding house, all of that. They need more single family. So we're talking about equity. We're talking about diverse housing type for all neighborhood, different sizes. In historic Black neighborhood, the ownership rate is low. So we're promoting ownership, following up the next question about how to do gentrification, prevent gentrification, and anti-displacement. So yes, it is very important. That's why the policy is included in our comprehensive plan, just about that. How we implement that, we work mostly with the other office. There's an office, I'd like to give them a shout out. Housing and Community Development has developed a program or strategy, anti-displacement strategy. There's a long list of things they are already finished, they're currently doing, including some of the things Yuna had mentioned, like a down payment assistance to help people who live there become owners, or put a moratorium on the taxes, the property tax, that when you do improvement on your property, right, your property go up. So put a moratorium on that. That's have been done. And also, prevent eviction prevention program. There's a long list of strategy that they come up with, which is very good. I think we have to be, equity is not about equal everywhere. It has to be intentional. So I think we do, have to treat differently. When I hear, I don't want multifamily in predominantly very wealthy neighborhood with zero multifamily, that's different when I hear from our, African-American neighborhood saying, I don't want it because they saying they had enough.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you, Terry. I want to ask one more question before we shift to the audience Q&A, which, by the way, there are lots of questions already in the Q&A box. So I do want to give time to get to those. But, we've talked a lot about public engagement, some of the challenges around thinking about single family zoning, how to address issues of gentrification and displacement, which are very real when you're trying to not create and undo historical harms, but not create additional harms. I wanted to shift a little bit to the public engagement process. Emily talked about earlier some interesting ideas and concepts for getting at it, but this has become a big debate because some people believe that public engagement is too focused, honestly, on the needs of whiter, wealthier people, and that is to the detriment of the need to build housing. I'm curious from any of the panelists, what do you think? Can we incorporate residents' point of views without inhibiting housing construction or the creation of more affordable housing? Anyone?
I can go ahead and start us off with this one. Well, Jerusalem Demsis actually wrote a really great article about this that was released recently. It's about challenges to community input in zoning and land use decision-making processes specifically. And these processes, like you said, Monique, are essentially hyper-local and dominated by groups that are disproportionately white, rich, and who own homes. So one point that she makes, and that we also make in our research about increasing production through zoning reforms, is about this mismatch between this hyper-local level of engagement on individual projects and their potential larger regional or national aggregate impacts. So potentially shifting some of these land use decision-making powers to regional, state, or federal governments could be a good thing to try and look into or experiment with or keep pushing for. But we also know that historically, many of these top-down, large-scale housing and land use decisions, like the Urban Renewal Administration in 1949 or the Federal Highway Act in 1956, have been definitely just overtly racist and really destroyed communities of color. So I do think it's absolutely necessary for there to be a level of outreach and input in these decisions, but ideally that engagement would really be targeted to ensure equitable long-term outcomes for residents. But yeah, it's a really tricky issue.
Thanks, Eleanor. Anyone else?
Yeah, I would love to actually give a story about this from Chicago, where I used to work, that I think is indicative of how we can do community engagement in a way that is better and that results in better outcomes. So I think there's a lot of discussion, as Eleanor pointed out, that unfortunately the traditional community engagement processes that we have out there have the tendency to attract people who can attend meetings, who tend to be wealthier, whiter, homeowner, and men. And that's not representative. That's not fair. Those people shouldn't be making all the choices. That doesn't mean, though, that the answer is to get rid of community engagement. That's an anti-democratic approach that doesn't actually give the ability of people who are lower income and people of color to engage at all. It just means that people who are in charge get to make the choices. And I don't think that's fair either. So a project I worked on in Chicago about 8 years ago was there was a parking lot adjacent to the Logan Square subway station in Northwest Chicago. This parking lot was in a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood, and it was owned by the city of Chicago. We worked to actually engage a wide cohort of the community in a series of 3 sessions to talk about what we wanted to see for the future of this parking lot. Okay, and these sessions were intentionally designed to bring in people from the community. And we ended up getting over 1,000 people to provide input. And we got a representative sample of people who actually represented the people who lived in that community. So in other words, not just wealthier and whiter people, but rather a whole diversity of what was going on there. And the result is that 8 years later, just last week, a project opened up on that former parking lot that's now 100 units of all affordable housing in a multifamily building right next to the subway station. And I think that that is a fantastic example of how effective community engagement can actually result in a better project, a project that actually benefits more people in the community. But it did require engagement and getting people on board with the idea. That is not easy, but we can't just give up on democracy. We need to actually take it seriously, and we need to do it right to make sure people are involved.
Thank you so much, Yona. I want to shift. We have a lot of questions. We are not going to be able to get to them all in the Q&A box, but I want to shift to Q&A. Maybe I'll start with this one. Terry, this question is actually directed for you. It's from a fellow council member in the audience. I find that every time I talk about doing away with single family zoning, I find people get very scared. How do we message these efforts in ways that bring those who are sort of persuadable to support these efforts?
I think, what I try to do is I try to build bridges around what people love about Berkeley, right? We all love the diversity of our neighborhoods, being able to meet different folks from around the world. And I think that when we go out physically into the neighborhoods, you see that, it's really rare that you go that many blocks without seeing different kinds of housing. Once people realize that they've been living with a multitude of housing types, for their entire time being there, they relax a little bit. People sometimes think that, if we change the zoning, they will have to, for some reason, bulldoze their house, or or that the city's going to take their house away and build a giant tower in its place, which wouldn't happen for a number of reasons. But it is tough because people also feel attacked. They feel like we're saying that they themselves are racist, which that's no one ever wants to feel that way. As much as we can, when that's the case, as much as we can zoom out and look at the way that laws as a system create racism rather than rather than saying that the people who live in the houses themselves are racist, that disarms them of the fear as well. But I think the most success I've had is just like going out and showing people the different kinds of houses we have, the different kinds of housing, especially in, the Elmwood, one of our neighborhoods across town. There are so many beautiful old school apartments, old 10plexes and above, or 10plexes and below. Perhaps there is a 12plex somewhere in there. But I think it's really about, trying to rally people around the values that drew them to Berkeley and showing them the places where we ourselves, we being, the leaders of the city, have fallen short, and how in partnership with the community, we can redress those things and improve upon those things that we all value so much.
Monique, I know you didn't ask me, but I'm just going to briefly say that we did not use the term eliminate in Louisville because we have urban, suburban, rural, a lot of suburban area. We know that term is going to turn a lot of people off. We need their support. So messaging is important. The term we use is open up the single family. So we say the single families only have to open up for other use, like ADU. That's the first thing we did, open up for ADU. Maybe eventually right now working on missing middle, duplex, triplex, fourplex. But if we use eliminating single family, I think we're going to get a lot more pushback we have to deal with at this moment. So we use open up single family zoning district for other housing types and sizes.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you, Terry. There's another question. I think this is really geared towards Eleanor and Yona. It says, do you have any recommendations, I think from a research perspective, for measuring which policies are most effective in advancing equity? Either Yona or Eleanor.
So this is actually a fantastic question. We have a new op-ed that we just published in City Lab yesterday that would be great to put the link in here if possible, where we actually point out that, just eliminating single family zoning as a strategy in Minneapolis was not very effective, as Eleanor pointed to. There are all these other issues that we need to be talking about, in terms of parking regulations, in terms of providing provisions for people to be able to afford their homes and things of that sort. Now, unfortunately, or fortunately, the status of research on the equity impacts of zoning reform is just at its beginning. And one of the things that we're trying to do in Lulu in our lab is actually trying to investigate one of those issues. And I can actually point to some of the exciting research that we are undertaking now. And that is that we are looking at statewide zoning data in Connecticut, which is a diverse state with a lot of segregation and a lot of inequality, and trying to understand the relationship between the rules in specific zoning districts and outcomes in terms of racial segregation, in terms of housing construction and housing affordability. And I'm hopeful we'll be able to provide some good results on that in the coming months.
Thank you. Eleanor, did you have anything to add?
I mean, Yona said it well, but I also just want to emphasize individual level outcomes are so important. So really making sure that you're able to break down your data to look at outcomes by race, by gender, by family size, like that's super huge, and eviction too, because I think so many analyses I've seen are just about production and the supply side, and I would just really love to see more about stability long-term at the individual level, but that's super hard, so.
Thank you. Emily, there was a question for you around who you had to work with in order to get ADUs adopted as by right. Was that just the Metropolitan Council? Was that also state officials? I think someone was trying to sort of understand the mechanics of it.
So our zoning is mostly governed by Louisville Metro Council. We have 26 Metro Council members, so we work with them. It's important that this is the kind of experience I got from City of Minneapolis. I said, you know what, how does it take you to get to this point? They said, you need champions at the Metro Council. So out of 26 members, I work closely with a few of them as our champion together, because the law, it needs to be passed by Metro Council, become law. And so just after we pass our ADU, the second largest city in Kentucky, Lexington, also passed their ADU. Now they have ADU by right instead of going through a conditional use permit. And the two cities actually did a very good webinar on the subject, and I hope that Chad is going to be dropped in there, talking about how each of our city gone through this process and what the next step. And there's a lot of other things that involve in this banking, appraisal and all of that. But it's there's a lot of information in that link, so you can look a little bit more.
Thank you, Emily. Another question was, when pushing for housing and zoning reform in a smaller metro area, particularly one with strong NIMBY attitude and skyrocketing housing prices, what sort of partnerships are critical to foster to build an affordable and equitable community? And anyone can feel free to jump in.
I'll jump in, yeah. I think coalitions are key. You want to get like students, longtime residents, the environmentalists, labor is an important partner as well, the university, the faith community. So much of this is really meeting folks where they're at and really sitting there with their concerns. People have legitimate concerns about they themselves being displaced. People are also concerned about, seeing their neighborhood and their city change and them not having a say. Yes, sometimes we do, see, people claiming, more space than others. But, as leaders, we do have to acknowledge and sit with those voices and those experiences as well. It's not, I think in Berkeley, we would not be as successful if we were all just like, okay, everything you're saying is bad faith, and I'm just not going to listen. I'm going to kind of power ahead and throw everything to the wayside. It takes time and patience, and folks here have been really pushing for housing reform and fighting this fight for a long time. Since the very beginning of exclusionary zoning. And we do have a fair housing legacy here in Berkeley. So it's work that many of us are committed to, but it does take humility, and it takes acknowledging, okay, like there are folks who have experiences that I don't understand, that are not my experience. But everyone deserves the dignity and the respect of having those experiences heard. That being said, of course, there are some days where that's harder than others. But if we're really serious about equity and foregrounding equity in these reforms, we are going to have to really think through the legitimate concerns people have about displacement. And I think for me, sometimes it's like, I'm lucky that it's my job to do this, but like, sometimes it just takes, actually like calling someone that you're fighting with online, or sitting down over coffee, and getting out of the inbox and really seeing someone eye to eye. We've been able to move a lot of people that way just by showing that, as pro-housing people, as city leaders, we actually do care about the community, even if the person we sit with disagrees with us and will never agree. The fact that we take that time to meet them and sit with them goes a long way.
Thank you, Terry. I cannot believe this, but we are almost at the hour. I want to take a moment to just thank the panelists so much. Thank you, Yona. Thank you, Eleanor. Thank you, Terry. And thank you, Emily, for their incredible insights this afternoon. I also want to thank everyone who registered and joined us today. As I mentioned, today's event is the first in a series of events on advancing racial equity in our communities, where we'll continue to showcase the research and evaluation focused on advancing racial equity in the 6 practice areas within Urban's Metropolitan Housing and Communities Policy Center: fair housing and land use and transportation, housing as a foundation, community and economic development, cities and neighborhoods, ending homelessness, and climate and communities. We hope you enjoyed today's panel on fair housing and land use, and that you will join us again for the next event in the series. Thank you all so very much. Thank you again to the panelists, and everyone have a glorious afternoon.